This isn't strictly my PhD area. My PhD is on endings in the kind of narrative structural sense within fiction. But I got interested while I was doing it in questions of the end of everything, really, which is kind of raised simultaneously by some critics. But I think it's also the case that because there's a kind of strong tradition of theology at the university, there's an awful lot of books on, on apocalypse and revelation and things like that, and I got a bit fascinated by it. So it's a kind of side project, but I think it speaks, it's in dialogue really with the stuff I'm doing. So this paper is really thinking about how a genre with a 3,000-year history and particular prominence, I think, in the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century might be reimagined for a 21st century audience, perhaps an audience slightly jaded by established apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic themes. My account's framed by a postmodernist understandings of the meanings of apocalypse in a world in which revelation is hard to believe in, or as Teresa Heffernan argues in a book called Postapocalyptic Culture, the idea of the end no longer functions as direction, truth, or foundation. So I'll start with a bit of Baudrillard. How do we think about endings in life or fiction in an age in which, as Baudrillard tells us, everything has already become nuclear, far away, vaporized. The explosion has already occurred. The bomb is only a metaphor now. For Baudrillard, the apocalypse has happened. We're living in a destroyed world. For Laurent Ballant, on the other hand, the world is not destroyed, but it is profoundly damaged. Ballant asks how we can understand trauma in a historical present that is structured through what she calls crisis ordinariness, in which people are managing everyday lives in an impasse characterized by intense incoherence and precarity. Particular types of crisis seem to lend themselves to a playing out in the realms of the post-apocalypse. Frederick Jameson has argued, for example, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The two novels I want to look at were both published in 2015. I read both as apocalyptic fictions, or to be more precise, I'd characterise the Ishiguro as a post-apocalyptic fiction, and the Faber perhaps simultaneously apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. Both are, I think, distinctive in seeking a new perspective on and a new construction for a familiar genre. Both have settings we commonly associate with genre fiction. The Buried Giant has a fantasy section, fantasy setting, with its protagonist on a quest through a Dark Ages England. And the Book of Strange New Things has a science fiction setting, a distant planet where a commercial company is establishing a base for mass migration for those who can pay, as Earth is devastated by environmental catastrophe and the consequent social and political meltdown. Both novels deal with the struggle to maintain our sense of self and our closest human relationships in a traumatized world. In Ishiguro's novel, the cataclysmic events have already unfolded, but snatches of almost lost memory impel the protagonist to set off on the kind of aimlessly desperate quest familiar to us from Cormac McCarthy's The Road, for example. In Faber's text, the apocalypse unfolds during the course of the novel, though, as in Laurent Ballant's account of the present crisis, the extraordinary always turns out to be an amplification of something in the works. Both novels speak to central challenges of the critical literature. How can we speak about apocalypse without a belief in revelation? Both seek in their own way to negotiate a central structural challenge for writers of apocalyptic fiction, which is how to write beyond the end of the world. And a particular interest for me, given my PhD subject, is how to end beyond the end fiction. But before I say too much about the novels, I'd like to spend a few minutes looking at the framing context in order to underline what I think's apocalyptic about the novels I've chosen. So traditional interpretations of apocalypse. Firstly, the idea of apocalypse is as the eschaton itself, the imagined end of the world as described in the Book of Revelation. Second, it's the original Greek sense of apocalypse is an unveiling, uncovering, or revelation. And thirdly, it's come to be used for a catastrophic event in which in some way resembles the eschaton. Some kind of cataclysmic historical rupture signifying the end of an epoch and the consequent reimagining of the world. So examples might include the Holocaust or the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima or the election of President Trump. As James Burgess says, the apocalypse then is the end or resembles the end or explains the end. Got a little list here of things that I think are apocalyptic narratives and neo-apocalyptic narratives. For the purposes of this paper, I the cue here comes from Sheree Deckard, who divides apocalyptic narratives into three. Traditional apocalypse is about the end of the epoch and features in the Christian literature, and often involves a vision of a new Jerusalem. Neo-apocalyptic narratives are those that are primarily set at the time of a cataclysm. So, for example, an early example would be Mary Shelley's The Last Man. The post-apocalyptic genre is actually probably the one that's engaged the kind of literary hard-hitters as well as genre writers most recently, and this is just a very small selection of texts and films that I considered. That's just a selection of critical sources I consulted looking at how writers have used narratives of apocalypse to make sense of the human experience. Frank Kermode explained our deeply ingrained attraction to apocalyptic narratives as an existential desire for narrative closure. He says, to make sense of their span, human beings need fictive concords with origins and ends, such as give meanings to lives and poems. For the writer Paul Fiddes, writing in 2000, Kermode's representation of the book as a model of the world neglects the potential for literary text to create new worlds of possibility, though. Fiddes says that, writing from a Christian eschatological position, says that all fictional texts are innately eschatological, in the sense of being open to the new meaning that will come to them in the future, and open to the horizon that death gives to life. He's interested in the capacity of the text to redeem as well as to console. And in contrast to Kermode, who he sees as unduly bound up with closure, Fiddes finds that the creative and redemptive power of text might often be found in open endings. And I think that's quite interesting with regard to both of these novels. Fiddes' intellectual role model is Northrop Frye, whose archetypal criticism reveals the mythological framework behind the text, reflecting not the reality of the everyday world, but the creation of a desired world. Eschatology remains a thriving tradition within theology. Fiddes is unusual in applying it to literary criticism. Much of the recent critical literature in literary studies is characterised by a more sceptical approach to apocalypse. The bleak question raised by the text on the slide here is why, in a post-Nietzschean world, we might have any interest in the possibility of an inherently meaningful end, and how we understand and deal with the hollowness of our postmodernist future when the world is damaged, or if we believe Baudrillard, destroyed completely. And here's a quote which illustrates that from Teresa Heffernan. We've reached the end of the end, apparently. So where can we go for a little bit of possible hope and redemption in the post-apocalyptic literature? James Berger, in a book called After the End, is interested in the paradox that in almost every apocalyptic text, apocalypse brings about neither the end of the text nor the end of the world, in fact. He says the end itself, the moment of cataclysm, is only part of the point of apocalyptic writing. The apocalypse as eschaton is just as importantly the vehicle for clearing away the world as it is and making possible the post-apocalyptic paradise or wasteland. After the End is an exploration of the character of this post-apocalyptic terrain. He moves from visions of the end to visions after the end. If narrative marks the human passage on Earth, what happens afterwards? And Berger repeats the challenge posed by Wittgenstein. In order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have been able to think both sides of this limit. We should therefore have been able to think what cannot be thought. He notes that very few apocalyptic representations do actually end with the end. There's always some post-apocalyptic fragment. His narratives after the end are linked to the literature of trauma. After both trauma and apocalypse, all existing structures of identity, language and memory have been erased, and narratives must be reconstructed by means of their traces, their survivors and their ghosts. It's not actually an afterlife that Berger is interested in, or not in a religious sense anyway. He wants to use apocalypse to go beyond the everything is changed yet everything remains the same trope, to, as he says, identify the culture's symptoms and allow its ghosts to speak. So I'll move on to talking about the novels themselves. The Buried Giant, which I have here in a copy beautifully signed by Ishiguro, which I'm rather proud of, takes the form of a quest story. though the purpose of the quest is shrouded in a mist of forgetfulness that seems to be shared by everybody in the land. The story opens in an isolated ancient Britain village, dug deep into a hillside, where an elderly couple, Axel and Beatrice, are considering a journey. Their memories of the past, and even the relatively recent past, is very hazy, but in flashes they remember that they have a son in a neighbouring village and they set off to find him. They take a journey across desolate terrain, described hauntingly in the opening passages of the book. And they have various mysterious meetings. They meet a boatman and a vengeful widow who's been denied passage to a mysterious island with her husband, as their bond of love was judged to be too weak. They go to a Saxon village which is being terrorised by ogres, and they meet the village elder, who suggests, in a interestingly post-Nietzschean way for a Saxon, that the fog may mean that even God has forgotten them. Axel and Beatrice continue on their quest, accompanied by a warrior called Wystan and the boy Edwin, whom the warrior has rescued from the ogres. And they travel to a monastery where Beatrice's ailments can be tended. On their journey, they also meet and travel with the elderly Sir Gawain, who claims still to be on a quest given to him by King Arthur many years before to kill the dragon Querig. Through the course of the book, we discover that it's the breath of the dragon Querig which has spread the fog across the land as a result of enchantment by Merlin, and it was on Arthur's command, and that the fog is actually deliberate and is designed to preserve the precarious peace between Britons and Saxons after many years of murderous struggle. Axel was also involved in this as a knight of King Arthur. So rather than trying to kill the dragon, actually Gawain's been trying to preserve the dragon. And as have the monks that Axel and Beatrice have come to find. At the heart of the novel is Axel and Beatrice's own relationship. They're terrified that the fog's theft of their shared memories will lead the boatman at the end to refuse to take them to the island together. And they reach the conclusion that despite the potentially devastating consequences, communal consequences of restoring memories of violence, and the devastating personal consequences in terms of memories of betrayal and suffering, the fog must somehow be lifted. Ishiguro said of the central dilemma of the book, every society, every person even, has some buried memories of violence or destruction. The buried giant asks whether awakening these buried things might lead to another terrible cycle of violence, and whether it's better to do this at the risk of cataclysm, or whether it's better to keep these memories buried and forgotten. It might seem completely counterintuitive for me to be examining the postmodern apocalypse through a story set in immediately post-Arthurian England. So what leads me to say that this is an apocalyptic narrative? I think it adheres to two of the conceptions of apocalypse set out earlier, and that it's framed by a catastrophic event which resembles the eschaton, the violent struggle between the Saxons and Britons. And also that central to the narrative is an unveiling or uncovering which will lead to a new era. We know from history, in fact, that the story does take place at the end of an epoch, and that within a very short time the Britons had been thoroughly defeated by the Saxons and pushed to the Celtic fringes of Britain. In terms of my interest and the interest of writers such as Commode and Fiddes and the relationship of narrative to apocalyptic endings, the narrative tension about the book is all about resistance to endings, I think. The fog has been conjured to hold the eschaton at bay, but endings inevitably come. As the fog lifts in The Buried Giant, the comfortable oblivion of Axel and Beatrice's companionship is challenged by melancholy memories. They remember that their son is long since dead, and it's the fog that's prevented them from coming to terms with their grief. The real purpose of their personal quest is revealed. They are to travel to meet the boatman too, who will ferry them to the island where their son has long since lived. But will they be allowed to travel together, or must apocalypse always be faced alone? Ishiguro said in an interview that the central theme and mood of the novel became apparent to him some years before he decided on the setting. He needed a setting in which the premise of a deep collective trauma leading to mass amnesia made sense. And indeed, he considered setting the book within a contemporary conflict landscape such as Rwanda or Bosnia. He reached the conclusion, though, that his strength as a fiction writer was in his ability to take a step back. I prefer to create a more metaphorical story that people can apply to a variety of situations, personal and political. This then is the narrative within which the archetypal patterns of Northrop Frye's apocalyptic are clear. The mythical nature of the novel is compounded by the very formal language, and you'll see an example of that up here. Conversations are always measured and courteous, even as they express deep foreboding. Another archetypal feature is the naming of the central female character, Beatrice. And actually, this is a really interesting link with Michel Faber's novel, since the female character there is also Beatrice, though that's not why I chose it. In both cases, I read her as Dante's Beatrice, the incarnation of beatific love who guides Virgil through the afterlife. So while there may be allusions to the Divine Comedy and the wastelands which form the landscape of the novel are familiar to readers of the Gawain poet, for example, they're also reminiscent of the ruined post-apocalyptic landscapes of Cormac McCarthy or Jim Crace, in whose work we also find small groups of wanderers who band together with others in a desperate quest for survival, for which the prospects are ever bleaker. In fact, I can't really think of a post-apocalyptic novel that doesn't involve a small band of survivors, clubbing together for safety. So if anybody can, I shall be interested. The pace of the novel is unhurried and dreamlike. Events that would be action scenes in a typical fantasy novel are recounted in retrospect or from a distance. The scene that would be the highlight of any fantasy movie, which is the warrior Wyston's brilliant entrapment of the army of Lord Brennus within a burning tower. It's really dramatic. But we're never shown it directly. The rehearsal of it is recounted to us by the boy some time later. So I think the sense of distance seems reminiscent of post-apocalyptic fictions too. The drama's happened. What we're observing is how it affects the ghosts who have to live with the trauma. Michel Faber's novel, in complete contrast. This is this one. This is a distinctive contribution to the apocalyptic genre, in that it's duly underpinned by the familiar hopelessness of the postmodernist apocalyptic imaginary, but also via its central character. It's illuminated by visions of St. John's New Jerusalem. So this is why I say it's an apocalyptic as well as a post-apocalyptic. These competing apocalyptic understandings are held in juxtaposition with each other throughout the book. It's the story of a Christian pastor, Peter Lee, who's recruited as a missionary to work amongst the indigenous people of the far-flung planet of C2, where a colony is being established. Peter leaves behind his wife, Bee, his soulmate, who saved him from a life of homelessness and alcoholism. And he found his mission as a pastor through Bee. The mission is controlled by a mysterious multinational known as USIC. And it's indicative of its mysteriousness that we actually never find out what the acronym means. The Earth-based opening chapters make it very clear that this tale unfolds in the very near future. Space travel may have made a giant stride, but people over 35 still struggle with smartphones. And it follows the familiar logic of contemporary rentier capitalism. The company have capitalised on the collapse of American real estate by taking on repossessed homes and forcing their owners to work with them for peanuts to pay back the debt. You go to any sinking city in the country, said a USIC employee to Peter, and you'll find lots of people in the same boat. They may tell you they're working for this or that company, but scratch underneath and they're working for USIC. The company have taken over defunct factories all over the former Soviet Union, and they've even bought Cape Canaveral as their launch site to give credibility to their black brand. The extent of their global influence is hidden by a completely familiar mass indifference. People say things like, these days, the bigger the company, the less you can figure out what it does. The planet's been renamed Oasis in a Name a New World competition, which is somewhat ironic since it turns out there's no water source on the planet at all, other than the daily arcs of horizontal rainfall. Peter's voyage to Oasis is a kind of journey into the Baudrillardian hyperreal. A woman in a white coat injects him with a substance that she says will feel like a pint of cold yogurt travelling up your veins. And he wakes up a month later, delirious, sticky, and dressed in a loincloth, having been apparently catapulted through time and space by the physics-defying technology of the jump. He awakes in a room that he's led to believe is on board a space shuttle, spinning aimlessly in the general vicinity of Oasis, with a pilot desperately calculating whether they've got enough fuel to actually make it to their destination. But there don't seem to be any windows or any other way of confirming they're in space. And when they arrive on the planet, it's so smooth, Peter has to be told they're there. And the building they arrive in looks exactly like the one he left in Florida. The fact that they've travelled at all is completely a matter of faith. The base Peter arrives in is the epitome of the soulless postmodern. It's like a shopping mall in Reading at midnight. It has endless identical corridors, pipe Patsy Cline music, out-of-date copies of gaming and porn magazines, and most disgustingly, and fairly unlike Reading, I think, a maggot-based food technology that replicates ice cream and chocolate sauce. The staff on the base are skilled operatives. They're friendly, but they're detached, and they're very cynical about Peter's sense of mission. It's clear that they've been selected carefully by the corporation. They're all, in some sense, damaged people who've experienced trauma without significant connections to other people on their home planet. Peter's completely the exception in this. He maintains a really strong communication with his wife, Bee, and he's given privileged access to a communication system called the Chute. So because of the Chute, the novel's partly epistolary in form. We learn through Bee's messages on the Chute of the unfolding devastation on Earth as financial and environmental meltdown combine and mass civil unrest ensues. Bee and Peter's beloved cat is stolen and tortured by a gang of kids. Bee is forced to leave her home. So far, so dystopian. But yet, on his first trip beyond the base, the sense that this is all some kind of conspiracy lifts. It's not only the weather, illustrated on the slide. It's that Peter's Oasan flock are actually alien in every respect. They have faces Peter describes as like a placenta with two fetuses, maybe 3-month-old twins, hairless and blind, with a tangle of translucent flesh that might contain, in some form unrecognisable to him, a mouth, nose, eyes. Their flesh smells sweet, like fruit, and their speech, he says, sounded like a field of brittle reeds and rain-sodden lettuces being cleared by a machete. They have an alien orthography too, which is actually represented in the pages of the book and brings the shock of the alien to the reader. They're also alien too in terms of the cynical postmodern culture Peter's come from, and their lack of guile, their extreme politeness, and their eagerness to study what they call the Book of Strange New Things, and to master the technique of Jesus. In many respects, their peaceable farming community resembles a vision of a Christian good life, a perception strengthened by the robes that the Oasans habitually wear, by the fact that all the Christian converts are renamed Jesus lover, and by their tendency to burst into spontaneous choruses of amazing grace. Peter finds himself really wholly caught up in their community to the extent to which his everyday life on Earth with Bee, not to mention the catastrophe which is engulfing the planet, begins to disappear in a fog of forgetting, really very related to the Ishiguro fog of forgetting in The Buried Giant. In that post-apocalyptic state, it's almost impossible to remember life before. So Peter decides to live amongst the Oasans, to learn their language and to build a church with them. He witnesses the birth of a baby Oasan who emerges from the head of its mother in a communal ceremony and can immediately stand on its own feet. And more strangely and disturbingly, we witness the harvest that follows an Oasan death, with the body left to decay and attract insects who lay eggs. And both the insects and larvae are harvested to make food, ice cream and chocolate sauce. A very literal interpretation of what afterlife might mean. The style and form in which this narrative is played out is an important part of its effect. Peter's descriptions of his life on Oasis are unhurried, strangely beautiful, contrasting with the apocalypse on Earth, which is reported in frantic, increasingly hysterical messages from Bee. But Peter often actually doesn't read these till several days later, such as his absorption in his new Jerusalem. And the growing disconnect between them reveals a paradox of being at once removed from the crisis and intimately connected with it. The interesting question is, where are we as readers? Are we with Peter in heaven or with Bee on Earth? In addition to the partly epistolary form, I think a really distinctive and interesting narrative feature of this novel is that each chapter is given a title drawn from the last few words of that chapter. So you have a sense that you know what's going to happen. But in fact, the narrative arc that appears through the contents list, and there is a distinct narrative arc, I think, if you look at it, is not the same as the narrative arc of the novel itself. Or at any rate, I think it's one of several competing narrative arcs. The counter-narrative starts with redemptive hope, in contrast to the postmodern cynicism of USIC's colonisation. So 40 minutes later, he was up in the sky. He would never see other humans the same way again. The choir resumed. His whole life had been leading up to this. So, we lead up to a crescendo, and the crescendo, I think, is the birth of the Oasen child, hero of the moment, king of the day. And then we begin to see how the Oasens understand death and the practical use they make of it in terms of food technology. And things begin to come crashing down, toppling off an axis, falling through space. There is no God, she wrote. It's at this point, at the kind of top of the second column here, that Peter begins to recognise that though there are utopian features to Oasen life, it's not a plausible human utopia. His competing loyalties to his enthralling flock, to be on earth, and his inability to be able to live two lives at once, one of redemptive hope and the other of apocalyptic despair, drive him into the wilderness, where in a Conradian moment he finds his predecessor in the missionary role, a mysterious Mr. Kurtzberg. If one of the central revelations of this book is that the post-apocalyptic good life dreamed up by USIC for the wealthy of Earth is not actually tenable, it's revealed simultaneously that the good life the Oasens have constructed from the Book of Strange New Things is untenable too. It becomes clear that in learning the technique of Jesus, they're anticipating salvation from mortality. When hurt, even slightly, the Oasens have no self-healing mechanism. They're like haemophiliacs writ large. They bruise and they decay like fruit. Their relationship with their colonisers is based on two things they think they need: medicine and Jesus. Though some feasible hope is held out for the first, the second is, in Lauren Ballant's terms, a cruel optimism. The Book of Strange New Things ends with Peter returning to be, to a known apocalypse on Earth, from an unknown post-apocalypse on Oasis. Though with a knowledge of something we normally take for granted, the nature of mortal life is that things heal, and that in the scheme of things, this may offer all the revelatory promise we're going to get. What Peter realises is that we're bound as humans to figure out and to live with the political and moral implications of our actions. We cannot live in a fog of forgetting. We cannot transcend our own physical limits, and we cannot just get on with our jobs, ignoring the signs of crisis. We have a duty to each other. This brings me neatly back to Ishiguro, talking about personal responsibility in the face of apocalypse. Recently, he says, I've been interested in the difference between personal memory and societal memory. A society or nation goes on for centuries. It can turn Nazi for a while and cause mayhem. But then the next generation comes along and says, we're not going to make that mistake again. Whereas an individual who happens to live through the Nazi era in Germany, that's his whole life. And that has a promise of redemption in it, that things don't go on forever. We learn from Ishiguro that, even though the ancient Britons were destroyed, in fact, we know from history Saxon life wasn't all that bad. In fact, it created the city we're living in at the moment. There is revelation, even if there may not be on a personal, individual level. In the sense of an ending, Commode makes the claim that apocalypse is no longer imminent, but immanent. In both of these novels, we have endings that are open in the sense that Fides talks about, open to the imminence of despair, but also, I think, to the immanence of some kind of post-apocalyptic redemption. The world may be damaged, as Lauren Ballant shows us, but while our human bonds remain, it's not yet destroyed.